Today we're going to be working on 93 prep tests, beginning with the section 1. And this is going to be what you consider a reading comprehension. So we're just going to try to do the first passage and go from there. I already have the key highlighted for the initial sentence. The late 1950s and the early 1960s were a time of profound growth for the civil rights movements in the United States. Instead of putting 1950s, 1960s, I just put 50 and 60. And if you take a quick look, you can see that it's in 1900, so you can just work up the last two digits. So for civil rights, I have it C/R. And for movements, I didn't spell the whole thing just to save time. Although racial segregation in the public schools had been outlawed in 1954. So, racial segregation outlawed in public schools in 54. The ruling applied to only this one category of discriminatory practice, U.S. society. But further within the African American community, they anticipated the broader change. So I'm going to put AACOM change, so African American community change. It was in this climate that the student sit-down demonstration of the early 1960s were born, meaning that the sit-in the 60s started. The technique of the sit-in was simple, as African American occupying whites-only seats in racial segregation establishments, but this new type of student activism galvanized established civil rights organizations, brought about the creations of new ones, and generated support for civil rights movements among many new segments of the populace. So created new what you consider opportunities. So right now it's kind of with the first paragraph. I took some notes. I'm not saying that these is going to be the answers, or this will even be a question at all on the law school admissions test. That what year did the sit-in start? But just to gather some quick details, I went ahead and go and put in some key notes here. So 1560 civil rights movement started. Racial segregations outlawed in public schools in 54. The African American community decided to do a change. The sit-in started in the 60s, and this created the new opportunities, what I have so far. Now here comes the second paragraph. Initiated by 4 students of the North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College, the first sit-in occurred at a lunch counter in February 1960. So, first sit-in February 60. Sit-ins then spread rapidly through the southern U.S., involving 70,000 participants in August 1961. So, this is going to be for the southern portion, and it's going to be 70,000 in the year 61. The sit-in provided an important model for non-violent protests and showed students that they could affect the political process. So, sit-in is considered non-violent. The influence of these demonstrations on the determination of the students' activism was practically visible in 2 events. So, we're going to have 2. The formation of the student NCC, Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the birth of a second form of sit-in called Freedom Riders. So right now I have 2. Quick recap, we're at with the second paragraph. The first sit-in started in February 60. 70,000 people participated, and this was affected the southern nations. Sit-in is non-violent, which formed 2 organizations, NCC and Freedom Riders. Here we go with the third paragraph. The formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee followed the first sit-in by just a few months, and not only solidified student involvement in the civil rights movement, but also placed students' leadership roles for the first time. So leadership developed first time. It operated independently of other civil rights organizations and relied on strong local leadership, helping transform students' involvement from participation in small-scale protests into a sustained effort to challenge discrimination through the U.S. So a challenge against racial discrimination in the U.S. But the development that marked the clearest turning point for the civil rights movements was the Freedom Riders. So civil rights turning point was Freedom Riders. The goal of the rides which were organized in 1961 by already established Congress Racial Equality, which challenged segregation through occupying whites-only sit-ins on interstate buses and in facilities through the various terminals at which the bus stopped. So they were doing the sit-down methods at facilities, and buses was one of the facilities as well that was incorporated. Because the rise inspired violent reprisal in some regions, the U.S. government began using force to protect the safety of the Freedom Riders. This was the first government action taken explicit in support of the cause of desegregation outside the public schools. So this government decided to do protection for the Freedom Riders for the first time. Not because the Freedom Riders were causing the violence, but because they were the violence was coming from the other side. So that's why the government decided to do protection of safety for the Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders thus helped to take the civil rights movements to a new level by underscoring the U.S. government and to U.S. society generally the harsh reality of segregation system. So they were using the harsh reality, what was being out there, to get their way, and by providing for students and the elders alike example of the methods they might use to achieve a more equal society. Also, Freedom Riders gave some equal opportunity. So right now, kind of recap on the third paragraph. Leadership developed for the first time, challenge against racial discrimination in U.S. The turning point for the civil rights movements was the Freedom Riders. They did the method of sit-in at bus stops and other facilities. The government decided to protect the Freedom Riders for the first time because of their what you consider their safety. Freedom Riders' harsh reality. Harsh reality means that they were willing to show people the real reality of what's going on, and their goal is for more equal opportunity. So I'm trying to treat this like a logic game as much as possible. Here are the answers, and we're just going to read the first question. The primary purpose of this passage is to describe how useful in the early 1960s of a new tactic to combat discrimination social practice led to the transformation of the U.S. civil rights movement. That is a good primary answer. Let's see the rest of them. Chronicle of the activities of the civil rights movements during the late 1950s and 1960s that led to the first use by student activists and sit and demonstrate. Wasn't really like a chronological detail in between 50s and 60s. If you look around here, we have information regarding 61, and that's after the 60s. So we're gonna have to remove that. Contrast the various techniques and tactics used by the U.S. civil rights organization in the early 1960s to expose the injustice of racial segregation and achieve a more equal society. They didn't really talk about They didn't really expose too much in this passage about the harsh reality. There wasn't too much exposure going on, so no. Argued that confrontation and sit-in tactics were necessary in order for the U.S. civil rights movement to make inroads against racial discrimination in the late 50s and early 60s. Not too much that the sit-in was a point in between the 50s and 60s. Not really mentioned that. It didn't really recap that the first sit-in was really mandatory, really necessary to get the Freedom Riders involved or other leadership developed. So necessary means mandatory. It wasn't really a mandatory. Provided information on the extent to which the activities in the U.S. civil rights movements in the 50s and 60s were rooting in the earlier success of the movement. That was not in the passage. It was nothing about rooting or cheering for the Freedom Riders. So we're gonna have to eliminate that. The best answer is gonna be to describe how useful in the early 60s of a new tactic to combat discrimination social practice led to the transformation of the U.S. civil rights movements. And this is exactly what this kind of recaps here as well. So let's see if we're correct. And yeah, we got it right. Moving on. According to the passage, the outlawing segregation in the U.S. public schools in 54 had which one of the following consequences. So that was in the first paragraph. And we already took notice that the African community decided to do a change. The sit-ins were born and created new opportunities. So it led to directly the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, No, we didn't get into that to the third paragraph. And there wasn't just one organization. There was actually two organizations. There was also freedom riders as well. It served to encourage African American to expect a similar change to other parts of society. AA did a community change, and that's pretty kind of good with our notes that we took here, so let's select that one. Still going on, it provided a useful example of a method students might use to achieve a more equal society. That method of modeling wasn't really engaged until about the third paragraph when they started to demonstrate it further. And that outlaw, to be honest with you, when it comes to the outlaw, what's close to it is the AA community change. It's more closer to it. So let's take that one out. It dramatically concluded a period of profound growth in the U.S. civil rights movement. It mentioned the turning point was the freedom riders. So no, it wasn't really the outlaw that concluded the profound growth movement. It galvanized established U.S. civil rights organizations and led immediately to the creations of new ones. It didn't really say in this article that it shocked or that it excited the U.S. civil rights organizations, or it put the U.S. rights organizations into a position of shocked. So let's eliminate that one. Once again, go back to what we chose. It served to encourage AA to expect similar changes in other parts of the society. Exactly with our notes, let's go ahead and choose that one. And we got it correct. Moving on. Based on the passage, which one of the following can be the most reasonable inferred about the freedom riders? Let's take a quick look at our notes about the freedom riders. They were the freedom riders was a turning point for the civil rights movements. The government protected them. They used a harsh reality to get to persuade, and they're going for a more equal opportunity. They were primarily spontaneous phenomena. They weren't really sudden or instant. Didn't really say that they were sudden or instant. They were directed against the U.S. government. They weren't fighting the U.S. government. They weren't going against the U.S. government. If you recall, the government was actually protecting them for the first time. They were less important to the U.S. civil rights movements than they were originally in demonstration. That wasn't mentioned in the article, that the freedom riders are less important than the sit-in models. They were based on different philosophies than the original sit-in demonstrations. The freedom riders weren't really based on another belief or different beliefs. They were based on the same exact modeling, same method that was going on before. They were modeling on the original sit-in demonstration. That's actually a really good answer, because that's actually what they were doing, was using the sit-in as a method. So let's see if we can choose that one. And we got that one correct. Moving on. The discussion of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the third paragraph intended to primarily. So they're looking for the discussion of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, what we took notes about. And we have what we consider it's going to be the. I remember in the first sentence they mentioned they were going for a leadership development. So the information of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee followed the first sit-in method by a few months, and not only solidified student involvement in the civil rights movements, but also placed students into leadership development roles for the first time. It operated independently of civil rights organization, and this was to challenge the discrimination throughout the United States. So let's see if we can find that. Argue the premise of a particular U.S. civil rights organization. Okay, that could be a particular U.S. civil rights. Let's see if we can keep going. Serve as a contrast to discuss the effort of the student sit-in demonstration. Contrast means to differ. It wasn't really differ. They were actually similar with the sit-in methods. So it's not differ. Summarize the historical backgrounds against which the freedom riders flourished. It wasn't really to what you consider give the history information out. Describe the important outgrowth of the student sit-in demonstration. They did establish that by going through the U.S. Explain why local sit-in demonstrations require national effort. That wasn't really coordinated, as it just happened in the Southern, and they weren't really considered that needed all nations to help. So let's choose that answer, D, and we got it correct. Moving on to the last question. Which of the following statement most accurately expresses the author's view of this passage? regarding the freedom riders, well, it looks like they look at them as the first ones to use the harsh reality that we took notes about and come up with the more equal opportunity. So let's actually use that, because we